Welcome to Kalamazoo Missionary Church. My name is Joel. I'm one of the pastors here. We are glad that you are here with us this morning. We are starting a brand new sermon series today, and it's just called In the Beginning, or Stories of the Beginning, or something like that. I forgot the title I gave the sermon series already. Wow, this is going well. Anyway, and what we're doing is we're just going to begin to look right at the very beginning of the Bible. Genesis chapter 1 is where we're starting this morning. And over the next 11 weeks, we are going to just kind of take roughly a chapter a week. We'll go through the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. And that song that Andrea just sang is all about creation and how God created things and how the universe itself worships God, and therefore we should do the same, right? That's kind of the message of the song. And so we're going to look at this. Now, I want to acknowledge a couple of things before we get started this morning. Is I recognize, and you may or may not know this, but I know that Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are the most controversial chapters in the entire Bible, right? There are more divisions and more debates over these first 11 chapters of the Bible than anything else. And so, well, frankly, I'm a little nervous talking about it, number one. And number two, I am not going to in any way, shape, or form pretend to have any answers for you on any side of any of these debates that are out there in the world. Because I think those things they're fine to think about on an intellectual level, but that's not really what these chapters are about. The Genesis 1 through 11 is the story of how God created the universe and everything in it, and how things began to go poorly shortly afterwards, right? That's kind of the gist of the story. And so we're going to focus on that, because if we focus on all the debates that are out there in this, then we lose sight of the fact that this is all about the love that God has for us and the grace that He offers us through Jesus Christ. And that's where I want to keep our focus as we go through these 11 chapters. Does that sound okay? If you want a more in-depth theological debate, there's plenty of content on YouTube, I guess. I would encourage you to check it out that way. And some of it's very, very good. But so I recognize that these are tricky chapters to deal with. And I think the main reason that these 11 chapters are hard, and especially chapter 1, which we're going to look at this morning, is because of the culture gap between us and the people that it was first written to. We have to keep in mind that Genesis chapter 1 was written over 3,000 years ago. Okay? That is important for us to keep in mind. People 3,000 years ago looked at the world differently than we look at the world today. They just had a very different mindset of what the world was than we do today. Now, does that mean that we're right and they're wrong? No, it means they experience the world differently than we do. And so if we take a look at these initial chapters of Genesis and we do it with the bias of how we view the world is the right way to view the world, we're going to get the wrong message from them, right? The Genesis chapter 1 and through chapter 11, they are written due to scientific principles. However, they are not the scientific principles that you and I understand today. They're very, very different. They were written for a culture and a people that have not seen the light of day for thousands of years. And so we need to understand that when we look at this text and realize, and there's a couple of things that kind of help me deal with this. Number one is a basic understanding of what the Bible is. And we've talked about this before. Many people view the Bible as something written by man about God. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. The Bible is a book written by God about man. And so if we can start there, then we can begin to open ourselves up to looking at it in ways that we don't normally look at other things that we read. So the Bible is a book written by God about man and how to relate to God. And so if we can keep that in mind, that'll help us, I think. And the other thing is just to realize that there are many questions that the Bible doesn't even pretend to answer. That's not why it was written that way. And so a lot of the questions that come from our modern scientific thinking and philosophy, the Bible just doesn't address those at all. And it's not because those questions aren't important. It's not because we shouldn't get into those questions and talk about that. Those debates can be very, very healthy. That's not how it was written, right? And so we need to recognize that fact as we begin to look at chapter 1 of the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God, and see, because it's right in the beginning, it doesn't ever stay on that page. Does that sound okay? Am I making sense to y'all this morning? And so all of that being said, I am not an expert in ancient Near Eastern culture. And I am not an expert in theology. And so I'm just going to do the best I can to understand it in a way that makes sense to me and talk to you guys about that. And feel free to disagree with me all you want, and that's great. Cool? Cool. All right. So we begin the Bible with the book of Genesis, and we begin Genesis with chapter 1. And I'm going to try to kind of go through this day by day, I think. But verses 1 and 2, I think, sort of frame the rest of chapter 1. This is sort of our introduction, verses 1 and 2. And it says this. It says, in the beginning, God, which we can stop there, and I could actually talk for a long time just on that. In the beginning, God, right? But I'm going to try to keep us moving. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. These are words that if you've been around church for a while, you've heard these before, right? And what this is just a story. This is telling us right off the bat that this is a story of how God created the universe, okay? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's what that means. This is a story about how God created the universe, okay? And so I believe that verse 1 is sort of an introduction. And so when we look at the follow-up question that we often get today is, and this is something that causes a lot of debate, what is the beginning, right? You guys have probably gone down this rabbit trail before, right? What is the beginning? And I would argue that that's the wrong question to ask, because that's not what the Bible is addressing. It's not addressing a point of time. It's telling the story of how God created the universe. In our minds, modern day minds, we think, well, that must tell us about a certain point of time, but not necessarily. It's not nearly addressing that. And so we have all sorts of theories out there over how old the universe is, anywhere from as little as 4,000 years up to 15 billion years old. Who's right? I have no idea, and I don't really care. What I do care about is understanding the fact that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's what the Bible is trying to tell us. Does it matter how long ago it was? No, it does not. What matters is whether or not we believe that God created the universe. And if we do believe that, and if we do believe that this is a story written by God to us to tell us about these things, then we enter into a place of faith and trust and knowing that it's something that God did. Right? And I like to think of this, right? If verse 1 is the introduction to chapter 1, right? And so if we look at the phrase in the beginning, it doesn't necessarily have to be about a point of time the way it's worded in the original Hebrew. I think the beginning that it's talking about is chapter 1. So if we look at this 7-day piece of creation, right? Creation happened over the course of 7 days. We'll get into each of those days. The beginning is those 7 days. Does that make sense? That's kind of how I view it, and that's what makes sense to me, is in the beginning, over the course of these 7 days, God created the heavens and the earth. And here's how he did it, right? Does that make sense? Okay, good. That's where we're at. Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness over the surface of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Verse 2 is tricky. Verse 2 really speaks to the culture of the ancient Near East, right? All of these elements that we see in verse 2, the darkness and the deep and the waters and all this other stuff that's there, are addressed in other cultures around Israel at this point in time. And so every culture in this area of the world had stories and had myths about empty darkness, surfaces of the deep, and water, right? And all of those stories and all of those myths basically came down to all of those things that verse 2 is talking about. Those are all agents of chaos, agents of disruption, things that don't allow existence because they're so chaotic, right? And so what verse 2 is telling us is that God had control over all of these chaotic things that he created. And he began to, as we see over the course of the next few days, he begins to place a sense of order over the chaotic things in the universe and begins to build a place, well, frankly, for us, where we can live and thrive. And we'll see that. The Genesis chapter 1 is all about human beings and about how God created the earth for us, right? And so we're going to see that as we go through. So that's what verse 2 talks about. And then we get into the first day, right? God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. We'll notice that light just comes into being because God said it to be so, right? And so one of the initial things we're supposed to recognize right off the bat is the power and the majesty of God. Not only does he have control over every chaotic thing in the universe, but he also has the ability to order it around and make it obey him, right? God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and God saw that the light was good. He separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening and there was morning, and this was the first day. And so the first day of creation, God made light and he made darkness, and he separated those things into different things. See how he's taking chaotic things and he's putting them into order. And what he's really doing here, and kind of the idea we're supposed to get from this, is that God is creating the idea of ordered time. There's day, there's night, they follow each other, right? Things are no longer all happening at once. They've been separated out into time. Okay? You got that? So I think that's what day one was all about, is God creating the idea of time within the universe so that one thing follows another, rather than, without time, everything just happens all at once, right? Because there's no time to separate all the actions. So God's separating things out into time and creating order in the universe by making sure that things happen sequentially. Day 2, God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it, and it was so. God called the vault sky. There was evening and there was morning the second day. Now, this is where we have to go back in time and culture a little bit. So 3,000-ish years ago, 3,500 years ago, 4,000 years ago, however long it was, if I'm a small clan farmer, which everybody was a farmer back then, and I had to have my family to feed, and I knew that there was rivers that brought water to the crops, right? And I knew that there were lakes that had water in them, and I knew that maybe if I lived near an ocean, I knew that there was water in the ocean, right? So I knew there was water on land. But I also knew that sometimes it rained. And so there's obviously water in the sky. Well, and so the thought process was back then, well, if there's water in the sky, but it only comes down sometimes, there must be something solid up there to keep the water from falling down all the time. Otherwise, the water would always be falling down, right? This was the scientific view of the world back then. And so they had this idea of the firmament, right? Or this vault, I think is what it calls it in the NIV here. Yeah, the vault with this that separated water up in the sky from the water on the earth. And sometimes water would go through the firmament or through the vault and water the earth, and sometimes it would just stay up there. So this was their way of looking at the world. Now, we know today that the sky isn't solid, right? We know that because we shoot rockets and satellites and spaceships and stuff up there all the time, right? And so we know that it's not solid. Does that mean then that the Bible is wrong here when it talks about what's happening on day 2? No. What it means is that we have a different understanding of the world that they did. And this is the interesting part. When God wrote his Bible to his people, he chose to speak to them in a way that they would understand him. When Moses first penned down Genesis and gave it to the Israelite people, if in there it said something along the lines of, well, you see what happens to water is it condenses and then it evaporates and it goes up and it creates clouds, and then the clouds, when they condense enough, then that water turns, so water is turning to mist, which is turning to clouds, which is they don't need to know the water cycle. It wasn't important. The important thing is that God created these things. God put them in place where they should be, right? And if day one was all about creating time, then I look at this water cycle of day two, keeping in mind that everybody's a farmer at this point in time. I look at this as setting up kind of foundation for weather patterns, right? And so God's creating time, he's creating weather. We're at days 1 and 2. Day 3, what's happening on day 3? Let's take a look. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered into one place. Let dry ground appear, and it was so. God called the dry ground land. Gathered water he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And then God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with the seed in it, according to the various kinds. And it was so. And the land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, and it was the third day. And so if God is creating time on day 1, in day 2 he's creating weather patterns, on day 3 he's producing food for people. Right? We see that? What are the basic needs that human beings have? Right? We need food. We need to know how to protect ourselves from the weather. And we need to understand the concept of, as we move forward in time, things happen. Right? And so we're setting up the very basic understandings of how human beings interact with the world, which is interesting because if we look at Genesis, we see right off the bat, just in these first 3 days, that it talks about God creating the universe. It was written to human beings. Because all of the things that talk about aren't focused on mosquitoes. They aren't focused on horses. They aren't focused on trees or ferns or flowers or anything like that. They're written in a way that we can understand that God set these things up for us. I find that incredibly cool. We look as God he had this idea in his head, like, I'm going to create a universe, and I'm going to create it in such a way that it's going to benefit human beings the most. Kind of a sobering thought, isn't it? That the world was created for us. And yet that's exactly what we see here when we look at it. On day 3, he creates plants that bear seed, trees that bear fruit. All of a sudden, people have something to eat. Right? So that's day 3. Day 4. And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night. Let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. Once again, we see God speaking, and then this thing's just automatically happening. And then God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them into the vault of the sky to give light on earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning on the 4th day. So day 4, God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars, right? And they have a purpose. The sun and the moon and the stars, their purpose is to help us keep track of time, which he created on day 1, right? And so day 1, he creates light, he creates time. Day 4, we're going to see that he puts things in place on day 4 that rely on what he did on day 1. We're going to see the same things with days 5 and 6. They're going to rely on what he did on days 2 and 3. And we see that there's going to be a cycle that we see here. And so he creates the sun and the moon and the stars, and so that we can understand that there's a daytime, there's a nighttime, there are months, there are years. All of those things exist because of God, how God created the cosmos, right? And that's what he did on this day, is to give us an opportunity. Not only do we know that there's time now, but now we know how to mark time. Now we know that it takes 365 days for the earth to go around the sun. They didn't know that back then, but we know that now, right? And we can create a calendar off of that. And from that calendar, we can put certain things in place. Like we can say that Janine is coming home on the 30th. And that makes sense to all of us because we all know what the 30th of a month is, right? And we can track things like that because of the sun and the moon and the stars that God put in place to help us mark time. Now, we've developed other ways to do that. In the modern world, we have calendars and things like that. But back then, they didn't have any of those things. They just knew when the moon was bright, it was a new month, right? And when the moon was gone, it was the middle of the month. Or is that backwards? I don't really know the cycles. Anyway, you get the idea, right? And so it gave us a way to keep track of time. Once again, for our benefit. For our benefit. And so that was day 4. And there's something else I want to talk about day 4, but I'm going to wait till we get to the end and talk about it. So if I forget, remind me. Day 5, right? We're getting into day 5. We're over hump day, right? We're on the downside of the week. God said, let their water teem with living creatures. Remember what he did on day 2? He separated the waters, right? Now he's going to talk about what to do with the waters. Let the water teem with living creatures. Let the birds fly above the earth and across the vault of the sky, right? What else did he create on day 2? The vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in the seas and let the birds increase on earth. And there was evening and there was morning, and that was the 5th day. And so within the waters that God created on day 2 and within the vault of the sky that God created on day 2, he's going to create creatures to inhabit those things. And to those creatures, he says to be fruitful and multiply, right? And this is important that we understand that that's part of God's design. And so when we looked at the previous day when he created the plants, what did he say about the plants? The plants were going to produce fruit, which means they were also going to multiply. When we get to creatures on the 6th day, when we talk about that, he's going to say, be fruitful and multiply. So there is an idea within creation that there should be growth. There should be growth. Healthy things grow, right? And so that's a basic concept that we find within God creating the universe, is that healthy things grow. And that's going to come into play here as we get into some of the days, some of the other chapters of the book of Genesis. But day 5, he creates fish and stuff in the water. He creates birds and stuff in the sky. And then we get to day 6. And day 6 is a much longer story than the other days. And day 6 is kind of the culmination. All of Genesis 1 at this point is leading up to day 6. And this is where the important things are about to happen. You ready? God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds. The livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. So God created animals, right? God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. So the first part of day 6, we have land animals, right? And then God said, and you notice, before I get into that, you notice up to this point we've been in a bit of a rhythm, right? As we're looking at the days, that it starts off by saying, and God said, let there be. And there was evening, and there was morning, and it was the first day. And God said, let there be. And there was evening, and there was morning, and there was the second day. And God said, let there be. And there was evening. So we got this rhythm going. And then we get to day 6. And we said, God said, let the land produce living creatures. And it was, wait, we're breaking the pattern here. And then he said, right, in verse 26, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground. So we've broken the rhythmic pattern. Wow, I can't say that. Wow, someone else say it for me. You guys can do it. We've broken the pattern, right? And we're breaking the pattern with this concept of human beings. So whatever human beings are in this story of God creating the universe, whatever they are, it's worth breaking the pattern of creation to stop and talk about this. So there's something important happening here. And the first thing we see about human beings then, starting in verse 26, is that we are supposed to rule over all of the things that God has already created. You see that? God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule." That is our purpose. That is why God created people. We get that. Now, how many of you think about that on a daily basis? Not so much, right? Why? Because our purpose, because of the fall, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, has been so tarnished and we've been pushed so far away from our purpose that we forget that originally this was how God intended it. We were created to rule over all of God's creation, right? And so we see that in verses 26, just in verse 26. And then, sorry, I got to flip the page. And then in verse 27, here is where God is going to talk about how we are supposed to rule, right? So God created, this is how we're supposed to rule. God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful, multiply, increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." I mean, right now, you're sitting there, you're thinking to yourself, "Pastor Joel, I don't know what you're talking about. This doesn't tell us how we're supposed to rule." But yes, it does. But once again, we have to jump back in culture about 3,000 years to understand it. Okay, so back in the day, right? And by the day, I mean, pre-Abraham times, right? Back in the day, however long ago that was. If the ruler of a city, right, wanted to establish that this was his territory, what he would do is he would make a little statue, okay? And on this the statue would look like the king or the chieftain or whatever, right? Whoever was in charge. The statue would look like the person in charge. And then they would take the statue and they would bring it to a spot of land and they would place that statue down, and then he would go back to his city and he would do whatever he does ruling in his city. And the idea was that this statue over here was made in the image of that ruler. Same concept we see here in Genesis chapter 1. This statue was made in the image of that ruler and carried his authority. And so that anyone wandering around who saw that statue of that ruler recognized that this was his territory. And that if I'm a wanderer and I wander into his territory, that I am now under his control and rule and authority. Because he has set this image in the world. You guys starting to see the parallels here? And so, when God creates human beings in his image, it's the same concept that we see in the New Testament when Paul talks about being an ambassador for Christ. It's the same idea. We are created in the image of God so that wherever we go, we are declaring God's rule and authority in that place. And so if we have a hut on the beach, then we are ruling over the waters and the beach in God's name. And so if we have a cabin in the woods, then we are ruling over the world in God's name, over all the wild animals and the creepy crawly things and the birds in the sky. And so God is going to establish his authority on earth through his image, which is you and me. Kind of cool, isn't it? And that's our purpose. Once again, we're back to this is our purpose, is to rule over Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Verse 28. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. We are image bearers of God, and as such are his representatives wherever we go. And we are meant to establish his rule over the world by our very presence. He continues, verse 29. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, every tree that has fruit with seed in it, they will be yours for food. Not only are we ruling over all the animals, we're going to rule over all the plants. And to all the beasts of the earth and the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. It's not all yours, you got to share, right? Not all the plants are for us, the animals get to eat them too. And verse 31, and God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, and it was the sixth day. And so, we have a situation here where God creates everything, creates the universe, including the earth, the sun, all of us in our local Milky Way galaxy, plus everything else, right? And over his creation, he sets his image to rule. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, right? If we look back a little bit, let's just look at day 3. God said, let there be lights in the vault of day 4. God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night. Let them serve as signs and mark sacred times, days, and years. Let the lights in the vault of the sky give light on earth. And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light, the sun and moon. He also made the stars. He also made the land. He also made the water. He also made the creatures. He also made everything. Right? And so we see in this story, starting in the very beginning, starting in verse 2, these ideas of darkness and the deep and this chaotic water. And we see these ideas of light and these ideas of darkness, these ideas of animals, these ideas of planetary beings. All of these things in the culture in which this was written to were viewed to be gods. Everybody was polytheistic back then. Everybody knew that the sun was a god. Everybody knew that the moon was a god. Everybody knew that certain trees were God. Everybody knew that the waters were God. Everybody knew that the Leviathan that lived in the water was a representation of Satan and evil and a god. And so what Genesis chapter 1 is telling us is that God orders each of those things around how he wills it. And so everything that you think controls your life is really, in reality, controlled by God. And all of the things that everybody views as gods, as powers, as authorities, all of those things are put under the control of who? Us. We are to rule over God's creation. Well, mind-blowing, isn't it? And so if we look at how Genesis 1 speaks into the culture that it was written, we see that everything that people believed had power and influence in the ancient world had no power and no influence whatsoever, but was all under the control of God. And God had so much power and control over it that he was able to create us in his image and put us in charge of all these other powers and authorities and things that other people think are important.